Obviously, you'll do the right thing and share equally with your sister. My father's voice cut through the stale air of my parents' living room, and I felt the familiar weight of expectation settle on my shoulders like a yoke I'd worn my entire life. It was 3 days after we'd buried my grandmother Margaret. 3 days since I'd watched them lower the only person who'd ever truly seen me into the ground. And here I was, sitting on the same floral couch where I'd spent countless holidays, being invisible while my younger sister Claire sparkled in the center of every conversation, every photograph, every moment that mattered. My mother sat beside Claire on the love seat across from me, her hand protectively covering my sister's, while my father stood near the fireplace in that authoritative pose he adopted whenever he was about to tell me what I should do, what I should feel, what I should sacrifice. "Emma, you have a good job," my mother added, her tone suggesting this was obvious, indisputable, the only relevant fact. "Claire needs this money more than you do." I looked at my sister, 29 years old and crying delicate tears that somehow never made her face blotchy the way mine did, and felt something cold crystallize in my chest. The attorney had called me 2 days ago to inform me that grandmother had left her estate to me, approximately $800,000, plus the family lake house on the Finger Lake where I'd spent the happiest summers of my childhood. I hadn't told my parents this. Somehow they'd found out anyway. Probably called the attorney themselves, and now here I was, summoned to this family meeting that had clearly started before I arrived, based on the way they were all positioned, already united in their strategy. "Grandma Margaret knew Derek and I want to buy a house," Claire said, her voice breaking on our grandmother's name. "I can't believe she would be so cruel to me." Cruel. The word hung in the air, and I thought about cruelty, real cruelty, the kind that accumulated over decades in small cuts and casual dismissals and forgotten moments that were supposed to matter. I thought about being 8 years old and showing Grandma the story I'd written for school, how she'd read every word carefully and told me it was beautiful, that I had a gift, and I remembered how she'd kept that story in a folder in her desk, how I'd found it years later when I was helping her organize papers, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve like it was something precious. My parents had never read that story. They'd been too busy with Claire's dance recital costumes. "The will reading is next week," my father said, and something in his tone made it clear this wasn't a reminder, but an ultimatum. "We can settle this before then, as a family, the way your grandmother would have wanted." But I remembered what grandmother had actually wanted, what she'd said to me in the hospital 6 days before she died, her papery hand gripping mine with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll go to the will reading, Emma. Promise me you won't give up what's rightfully yours, no matter what they say." I'd promised, confused about why she'd made such a strange request, but now, sitting in this room where I'd spent 32 years being the responsible one, the practical one, the one who didn't need anything because Claire needed everything, I understood exactly what she'd known would happen. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The pattern had started so early, I couldn't remember a time when it didn't exist. This careful choreography where I made myself small so Claire could shine, where my achievements were met with distracted nods while hers earned celebrations that lasted for days. I was 17 when I gave my valedictorian speech to a half-empty auditorium because my parents had decided that Claire's cheerleading tryouts, happening at the same time across town, were more important. And I could still remember standing at that podium, searching the faces in the crowd for them, finding only Grandma Margaret in the third row, beaming at me like I'd hung the moon, her applause echoing in that space where my parents should have been. She took me to dinner afterward at the nicest restaurant in town, told me she'd recorded the whole speech, that she was proud of me, and when my parents came home that night, they asked if I'd won anything, seeming confused about why I was upset when I tried to explain what the valedictorian honor meant. Claire had made the cheerleading squad, and that was what mattered. That was what got discussed at dinner for the next 3 weeks. the uniform they needed to buy, the schedule of games, the way she looked in the pictures they took to commemorate the moment. I worked 2 jobs through college to pay tuition because my parents had spent my college fund on Claire's training with some life coach she'd decided she needed after her first breakup. $17,000 for someone to tell my sister she was special and the universe would provide. And when I graduated summa cum laude from the State University's accounting program, Grandma was the only family member who attended, who sat in those uncomfortable folding chairs for 3 hours to watch me walk across that stage. My parents had sent a card with $50 in it and a note that said they were sorry, but Claire needed help moving into her new apartment that weekend, her third attempt at living independently after dropping out of 2 different colleges. And could I maybe come by next week so they could take me to dinner to celebrate? Except next week never came, because Claire had gotten fired from her retail job and needed emotional support that apparently required all hands-on-deck family meetings that somehow never included calling me. Grandma took me to that same nice restaurant where we'd celebrated my high school graduation, and this time she gave me her mother's pearl earrings, the ones I'd always admired, and told me something I didn't fully understand then. Emma, you've built yourself into something remarkable without anyone's help, and that means no one can take it away from you. Remember that. What you earn yourself, what you become on your own, that's yours in a way that gifts never are. I became a CPA, started at a mid-sized firm in the city, worked 70-hour weeks, and built a reputation for being thorough, reliable, the person clients requested by name, while Claire cycled through jobs and apartments and business ideas that my parents funded with an endless optimism they'd never extended to my carefully researched plans. The pattern hadn't stopped when I became an adult. It had just evolved into more expensive forms of erasure, and 3 years ago, when my father had his medical crisis, the emergency surgery that insurance only partially covered, I'd given them $15,000 from my savings without hesitation, because that's what you do for family. That's what the responsible daughter does. And my parents had accepted it, with the kind of casual entitlement that suggested they'd expected nothing less, promised to pay me back when things stabilized. Except things had stabilized, and the subject never came up again, and when I'd gently mentioned it 6 months later, my mother had looked at me with such wounded surprise, asking if I was really going to make my father's health crisis about money, if I was going to hold it over their heads, and I'd felt so ashamed for even bringing it up that I'd apologized and never mentioned it again. Then there was the car, my reliable Honda that I'd paid off 2 years early, that Claire had borrowed for what was supposed to be a quick errand and had totaled on the highway, texting while driving though she'd never admitted that part. And when the police report came back and the insurance barely covered half the value, because she'd let her own policy lapse, my parents had sat me down with those serious faces and explained that Claire felt terrible. She was going through a hard time. Derek had just moved in with her, and they were adjusting, and I needed to understand that accidents happen and not make this into something that damaged our relationship, as if I were the one who'd destroyed something that belonged to her, as if my loss of transportation and the $5,000 I'd had to scrape together for a down payment on a used replacement were just unfortunate circumstances that everyone needed to move past, primarily me. Last Christmas had been the worst, though, the moment that I think finally broke something in Grandma, even if I hadn't recognized it then, because my parents had hosted dinner and announced Claire's engagement to Derek with champagne and toasts and my mother crying happy tears, and the entire evening, all 4 hours of it, had been devoted to wedding planning talk and stories about how Derek proposed and Claire showing off her ring from every angle, while my parents took dozens of photos, and my father made jokes about how expensive weddings were, but you only get one daughter married once, which was interesting since technically he had 2 daughters, one of whom was sitting right there, and not a single person asked me a single question about my life. I'd made senior partner at my firm 3 weeks earlier, the youngest person in the company's history to achieve it, an accomplishment that came with a substantial raise, and my own team and my name on the door. And I told my parents about it in a phone call that my mother had cut short because she needed to go help Claire pick bridesmaid dress colors. And sitting at that Christmas table watching them celebrate Claire's ability to get a man to propose, while my career achievement went unmentioned and unacknowledged, I'd felt something hollow out inside my chest, a space where hope used to live. Grandma had been there, sitting beside me, and I'd noticed her watching them with an expression I'd never seen on her face before, something cold and assessing. And when I'd gotten up to help clear dishes, she'd followed me into the kitchen and held my hand and said something that had seemed cryptic then, but made terrible sense now. "I see you, sweetheart. I've always seen you. Remember that." I hadn't understood why her eyes were wet, or why she'd hugged me so tightly, but she'd called me the next day and asked detailed questions about the partnership, what it meant, what my new responsibilities were, and she'd listened to every word like it mattered, like I mattered, the way she'd always listened to me when no one else would. The week before Grandma died was the week I learned what it meant to truly show up for someone. To sit in those uncomfortable vinyl hospital chairs under fluorescent lights that made everything look pale and unreal. To hold a hand that had held mine through every important moment of my life, and feel how fragile it had become, how the skin was thin as tissue paper and spotted with bruises from IV needles that never seemed to find the vein on the first try. I came every day after work, sometimes arriving at 6 in the evening and not leaving until the nurses gently suggested I go home and rest, and Grandma would be awake for some of those hours, drifting in and out of consciousness. But when she was awake, she was sharp, more focused than I'd seen her in months, like she'd been saving her clarity for these final conversations. My parents came twice during that whole week, both visits lasting less than 30 minutes. My father uncomfortable with the hospital smells and the reality of his mother's mortality. My mother checking her phone and making comments about how these things were just so hard on everyone, weren't they? And both times Grandma had watched them with an expression I couldn't read, something sad and resigned, and maybe a little bit angry, though she never said anything critical to their faces. Claire came once, on a Tuesday afternoon when I happened to be there during my lunch break, and she'd stood in the doorway looking uncomfortable, asking Grandma if she needed anything in a voice that suggested she hoped the answer was no. And when Grandma had said she was fine, Claire had left after less than 10 minutes, claiming Derek needed her to help him with something, though she'd never specified what. On Thursday night, 2 days before Grandma died, she'd been more alert than usual, and she'd held my hand with surprising strength and talked about justice and fairness and truth. Concepts that seemed abstract and philosophical, but also urgently important to her, and she'd made me promise something that confused me at the time. She asked me to attend the will reading no matter what, to not let anyone convince me to skip it, or to settle things privately beforehand, and she'd made me promise not to give up what was rightfully mine. Though I hadn't understood what she meant, because I hadn't been thinking about inheritance or money, I'd just been thinking about losing the one person who'd ever truly seen me. I'd promised, because you promise things to dying people because refusing felt cruel, and she'd relaxed after that, squeezed my hand one more time and said, "You're stronger than you think, Emma. You're going to need to remember that." She died peacefully on Saturday morning with me beside her, the monitors going from their steady beeping to that single sustained tone that means everything has stopped, and I'd held her hand through it and whispered that I loved her, that I'd keep my promise, whatever it meant. The funeral was 2 days later, and my parents were performatively grief-stricken, my father's eulogy full of platitudes about what a wonderful mother she'd been, my mother weeping dramatically in the front pew, and Claire had sobbed so loudly during the service that people kept turning to look at her grief on display in a way that mine wasn't, because I sat quietly with tears running down my face, holding Grandma's favorite hymnal, and remembering every moment she'd shown up for me when no one else would. After the service, during the reception at my parents' house, I'd been standing alone in the kitchen when my mother had approached me with that particular expression she got when she was about to deliver criticism disguised as concern, and she'd said, "Claire feels things more deeply than you, Emma. You've always been so practical." And that word, practical, had been delivered like an insult, like my quiet grief was somehow less valid than Claire's theatrical display, Like the fact that I wasn't falling apart in public meant I hadn't loved Grandma as much, when the truth was I'd loved her more than I'd loved anyone, and I was holding myself together because that's what I'd learned to do. That's what being the responsible daughter had taught me, to contain my feelings so they didn't inconvenience anyone else. 3 days after Grandma's funeral, I got a text from my father that said family meeting today at 4 p.m., important, be here. And the curtness of it, the way it was phrased as a command rather than a request, should have prepared me for what was coming. But I was still raw from grief, still processing the loss of the one person who'd made me feel valued, and I drove to my parents' house in a fog of sadness, arriving exactly at 4 to find my father's car and Claire's car already in the driveway, parked close together like they'd coordinated their arrival times. When I walked in without knocking, a habit from childhood that I'd never quite broken, I found them all sitting in the living room, my parents on the couch, and Claire in the armchair that had always been Grandma's favorite when she'd visited. And there was something about the configuration that felt strategic, rehearsed, like they'd been talking before I arrived and had arranged themselves deliberately. My father didn't waste time on pleasantries, didn't ask how I was holding up or acknowledge that we'd just buried his mother 72 hours ago. He just cleared his throat in that authoritative way he had and said, "We need to discuss the inheritance situation." And those words, the inheritance situation, made something cold settle in my stomach because I hadn't been thinking about money or wills. I'd been thinking about loss and grief and the way Grandma's hospital room had smelled like antiseptic and how her hand had felt in mine when she died. My mother jumped in before I could respond, her voice taking on that particular tone she used when she was about to deliver news she expected me to simply accept, and she said, "Margaret left her estate to you, Emma, all of it, which is approximately $800,000 plus the lake house. And before you say anything, we need to talk about what's fair here." And the number hit me like a physical blow, because I'd had no idea Grandma had that much money. She'd lived so modestly, and I was still processing the shock of it when my father leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and said, "Obviously, you'll do the right thing and share equally with your sister. This was clearly an oversight on your grandmother's part. She probably just named you because you're the oldest, or she thought you'd distribute it fairly." Claire was crying before anyone even asked her to speak, tears already streaming down her face in that theatrical way she'd perfected over the years. And she said through her sobs, "I can't believe Grandma would be so cruel to me. She knew Derek and I were looking at houses. She knew we needed a down payment. How could she just leave me nothing?" And my mother reached over to pat Claire's knee while looking at me with an expression that somehow managed to be both pleading and accusatory, and she said, "Emma, you have a good job, you make good money. Claire needs this more than you do. Surely you can see that. Surely you can understand that family means taking care of each other." I tried to speak then, tried to say something about Grandma's wishes and respecting what she'd wanted, but my father cut me off before I'd finished half a sentence, his hand slicing through the air in that dismissive gesture he'd perfected over decades of not listening to me, and he said, "Your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly at the end, Emma. She was old and sick and probably confused about what was fair, which was a lie because Grandma had been sharp as a tack until the very end, sharper than any of them, sharp enough to see exactly what they were and what they'd done." Claire's tears were escalating now, her voice taking on that particular pitch that had always gotten her whatever she wanted, and she said, "You've always had everything easier, Emma. You were always the smart one, the one who got good grades without trying, the one who got the good job, and I've had to struggle for everything." And the revisionist history of it, the absolute fiction of that statement, made something hot and angry flare in my chest because I'd worked 70-hour weeks to get through college. I'd studied until 2 in the morning while working part-time jobs. I'd earned every single thing I had while Claire had floated through life on charm and tears and parents who couldn't say no to her. My mother was looking at me with an expression of profound disappointment, like I was already guilty of a crime I hadn't even committed yet, and she said, "I raised you to be generous, Emma, to think of others, and frankly, I'm ashamed that we're even having to have this conversation. You should have immediately offered to share the moment you found out. And the word ashamed hit me like a slap, the way she wielded shame like a weapon she'd sharpened specifically for use on me. My father leaned back with his arms crossed, his voice going cold in that way that used to terrify me when I was a child, and he said, "Let me be very clear, Emma. If you don't do the right thing here, if you don't share this inheritance equally with your sister, you're going to damage this family irreparably, and that will be on you. That will be your choice and your responsibility." And the threat was implicit, but obvious. The message that if I didn't comply, I'd be cut off, excluded, blamed for destroying family unity that had never actually included me in any meaningful way. Claire suddenly sat up straighter, wiping her tears with the back of her hand in a calculated gesture, and she said, "What if we compromise, Emma? What if you keep 100,000 for yourself and give me the rest? That's fair, isn't it? You'd still have money, and I could get my house, and we could all move past this." And the audacity of it, the absolute gall of suggesting that giving me 12% of my own inheritance was a compromise, would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating. I felt the old conditioning kicking in. The lifetime of training that had taught me my role was to smooth things over and make everyone else comfortable and sacrifice my own needs for the family peace, and I felt myself starting to cave, starting to think maybe they were right. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe Grandma would want me to keep the family together. But then I remembered her face in that hospital bed, the way she'd gripped my hand with surprising strength and made me promise not to give up what was rightfully mine, and I remembered her words about justice and fairness and truth, and I realized this was the moment she'd been preparing me for. This was exactly what she'd known would happen. I took a breath and said, "I need to think about this. I need time to process everything." And my father's face darkened immediately, and he said, "What's there to think about, Emma? Either you're a decent person or you're not." And my mother added, "The will reading is in a few days. We need this settled before then. We need to present a united front." But I was already standing up, already grabbing my purse, already moving toward the door because if I stayed one more minute, I was going to break down or give in, and I couldn't do either. My mother's voice followed me to the door, sharp and cold. "Don't bother coming around until you've figured out where your priorities are, Emma, until you've remembered what family means." And I walked out without responding, got in my car with my hands shaking, and drove away from that house, feeling like I was drowning. I sat in my apartment that night with all the lights off, except for the small lamp by the couch, still shaking from the confrontation at my parents' house, and the first thing I did after I stopped crying was call Rachel, my best friend since college, the one person who'd witnessed years of my family's dynamics and had never once told me I was overreacting. She answered on the second ring, and I didn't even say hello. I just said, "They ambushed me, Rach. All three of them were waiting, and they demanded I give Claire almost everything." And she listened while I poured out the whole story, the inheritance I hadn't known existed, the immediate expectation that I'd hand it over, Claire's theatrical tears and my father's threats, and my mother's shame tactics. And when I finally ran out of words, Rachel was quiet for a moment before she said, "Emma, do you realize this is the exact same pattern they've always used on you? They create a crisis, they gang up, they make you feel guilty for having anything they think someone else deserves more. And you give in because you've been trained since childhood to believe your needs don't matter." And hearing her say it so plainly, so clearly, made something crack open in my chest. After we hung up, I sat there in the semi-darkness trying to understand why Grandma had left everything to me, what she'd been trying to tell me. And I remembered suddenly that I had a box somewhere in my closet, a cardboard box I'd brought from my old apartment and never unpacked, filled with birthday cards and letters Grandma had sent me over the years. I found it on the top shelf behind my winter coats, dusty and taped shut, and I carried it to the couch and opened it with hands that were steadier now, purposeful. And inside were dozens of cards spanning back to my college years. birthdays and graduations and holidays, and sometimes just random Tuesdays when Grandma had apparently decided I needed to hear from her. I started reading them chronologically, and a pattern emerged immediately, her handwriting always so careful and deliberate, and the messages were never generic. They were specific and personal and full of observations about my life that showed she'd been paying attention in ways no one else ever had. A card from my 23rd birthday said, "You are valued, Emma, not for what you do for others, but for who you are. Never forget that." And one from the year I made senior associate said, "I'm so proud of the woman you've become, strong and principled and kind. Don't let anyone diminish your light." And another from just last Christmas said, "You are enough, sweetheart, exactly as you are. You don't have to earn love through sacrifice. Real love doesn't require you to disappear." I read through all of them with tears streaming down my face because the theme was so clear, so consistent. Grandma had known exactly what I was living with. She'd seen the way my family treated me, and she'd been trying to build me up through these cards, trying to give me the validation they never would. And I realized her will wasn't just about money, it was about sending me a message so loud and clear I couldn't ignore it anymore. I put the cards back in the box carefully, reverently, and I made a decision sitting there on my couch at 11 o'clock at night, with the city lights glowing through my window. I would honor Grandma's wishes, whatever they turned out to be. I would attend the will reading next week despite whatever pressure my family applied, because she'd asked me to promise, and because for once in my life, I was going to choose the person who'd chosen me. The texts started coming the next morning before I'd even finished my coffee, my phone buzzing on the kitchen counter with a persistence that made my stomach clench, and when I picked it up, I saw 3 messages from my mother, 2 from Claire, and a missed call from my father, all of them landing before 7 a.m., like they'd coordinated their attack over breakfast. My mother's first message was long and rambling, something about family loyalty and how disappointed Grandma would be to see us fighting like this, which was such an ironic projection. It would have been funny if it wasn't so manipulative, because Grandma was the one who'd structured her will to protect me from exactly this kind of pressure. Grandma had seen this coming and planned for it, but my mother was rewriting history in real time to make me the villain. Claire's messages alternated between begging and guilt-tripping, the first one saying, "Please, Emma, I really need this. Derek and I have been looking at houses and we found the perfect one, but we can't afford it without help." And the second one saying, "I can't believe you're going to ruin my chance at happiness. I thought you loved me." And I could hear her voice in those words, that particular whine she'd perfected as a child that had always gotten her whatever she wanted. By the end of the first day, I had 17 text messages, 4 voicemails, and 2 emails. My father's voice on the recordings getting progressively colder and more authoritarian, and by Wednesday he'd sent a message that said, "We're having a family meeting Sunday morning before the will reading. You'll attend, and we'll settle this beforehand like reasonable people." Which wasn't a request or even an invitation, it was a command delivered in that tone that used to make me scramble to obey when I was young. I stared at that message for a long time, sitting at my desk during lunch break, feeling the old fear response kicking in. The conditioning that said, when Dad used that voice, you didn't argue, you didn't resist, you just complied. But then I thought about Grandma's cards and her promise I'd made, and the fact that I was a 32-year-old woman with my own career and my own life, and I didn't have to attend any meeting I didn't want to attend. I didn't respond to any of them, just let the messages pile up unanswered, and on Thursday I did something I'd never done before. I blocked all 3 of their numbers, muted their emails, cut off the channels they were using to bombard me with guilt and obligation, and the silence that followed was strange and frightening, and also deeply, unexpectedly peaceful. At work on Friday, I found myself sitting in my mentor Patricia's office during what was supposed to be a project review meeting. But instead, I was telling her everything, the whole messy story spilling out. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before she said, "Emma, I went through something similar with my family 20 years ago. They expected me to bankrupt myself to bail out my brother's failing business, and when I refused, they didn't speak to me for 3 years. And you know what I learned? People who only value you for what you can give them don't actually love you. They love what you provide, and that's not the same thing. Her words settled into my chest like stones, heavy and solid and true, and that afternoon I spent 2 hours researching inheritance law in our state, confirming what I already suspected, that I had absolutely no legal obligation to share anything with anyone, that Grandma's will was her business and her right and her choice. Saturday evening, as the sun was setting, I drove to the cemetery where we'd buried Grandma just 2 weeks earlier. The grave still bare earth without a headstone yet, and I sat on the grass beside it feeling ridiculous and comforted at the same time, and I said out loud, "I don't know if you can hear me, Grandma, but I'm going to honor your choices tomorrow. I'm going to keep my promise. I'm going to try to be as strong as you believed I could be." And I swear, I felt something shift in the air around me, some sense of approval or peace, or maybe just the evening breeze, but it felt like an answer. I woke up Monday morning with a sense of purpose that felt foreign and familiar at the same time, got dressed in my navy suit that I wore for important client meetings, because I wanted armor for what was coming, and I arrived at Morrison and Associates at 9:15 for the 9:30 will reading, early because I needed time to steady myself before my family showed up. The law office was in one of those prestigious downtown buildings with marble floors and dark wood paneling, the kind of place that announced serious money and serious business, and the receptionist was kind when I gave my name, offered me coffee which I accepted even though my hands were already shaking, and directed me to a waiting area with leather chairs and oil paintings of stern-looking men who I assumed were the firm's founders. I sat there holding my coffee cup without drinking, focusing on my breathing the way my therapist had taught me years ago when I was dealing with work anxiety, in for 4 counts and out for 6. And I was trying not to think about what the next hour would bring when the elevator doors opened and my parents walked out with Claire between them like they were her bodyguards. They saw me immediately, and something passed between them, some wordless communication, and then they walked past me to chairs on the opposite side of the waiting area without saying hello, without acknowledging me at all beyond my mother's withering look that said I was a disappointment and a traitor. Claire wouldn't make eye contact, just stared at her phone with her mouth set in that pouty expression she'd perfected as a teenager, the one that said she was the victim here and everyone should feel sorry for her. And my father sat with his arms crossed and his jaw clenched, radiating disapproval so thick I could feel it across the room. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the quiet classical music playing from hidden speakers and the occasional click of the receptionist's keyboard, and I found myself counting the seconds until someone would come get us and end this awful waiting. At exactly 9:30, a man emerged from the interior offices, distinguished and silver-haired, probably in his mid-60s, wearing an immaculate gray suit, and he said, "Thompson family? I'm James Morrison. I'll be handling Margaret Thompson's estate. Please come with me." And his voice was kind but professional, the voice of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. We followed him down a hallway lined with more dark wood and brass fixtures, into a conference room with a long table and high-backed chairs, and he gestured for us to sit, offered condolences again, waited while we arranged ourselves with my parents and Claire on one side of the table and me alone on the other like we were opposing legal teams. Morrison sat at the head of the table, opened a leather portfolio, and began with the standard legal language about last wills and testaments. But I noticed he kept glancing at me specifically, his eyes finding mine with something that looked almost like encouragement, or maybe recognition, like he knew something the rest of them didn't. He cleared his throat and said, "Margaret Ann Thompson's estate consists of investment accounts totaling $847,000, a lakeside property valued at $425,000, and various personal effects." And then he looked directly at me and read, "I leave all of the above in its entirety to my granddaughter, Emma Grace Thompson." And the words hung in the air for a moment before Claire gasped, and my mother's mouth opened to speak. Morrison held up his hand before my mother could get a full sentence out, his expression remaining professionally neutral but firm, and he said, "Please, let me finish. There's more to read." And something in his tone made my father sit back in his chair, though I could see his jaw working with suppressed anger. My mother started to speak anyway, the words tumbling out about undue influence and how Grandma had always been so close to Emma that maybe she'd been manipulated, and Morrison's voice cut through hers with unexpected steel when he said, "Mrs. Thompson, I need to be very clear about something. Your mother-in-law was evaluated by 2 independent physicians in addition to myself. She was of completely sound mind when this will was drafted 2 years ago, and her instructions were extremely specific and thoroughly documented, so I would advise against pursuing that line of reasoning." Claire's tears were escalating from quiet crying to something approaching hysteria, that gulping, sobbing sound she'd always made when she wanted maximum attention, and she kept saying, "I don't understand. Why would she do this to me? What did I ever do to her?" Which would have been funny if it wasn't so perfectly illustrative of her complete lack of self-awareness. Morrison opened the will document wider, adjusted his reading glasses, and said, "Margaret included a written statement explaining her reasoning, which I'm required to read in full." And then he began reading in that same calm professional voice. "I leave my estate to Emma, because in the 32 years of her life, she has demonstrated the character, integrity, and responsibility that deserves to be rewarded. She has been present when presence mattered. She has shown up when others stayed away. She has built a life through her own effort without expecting anyone else to fund her dreams or fix her mistakes." The words landed like physical blows around the table, my father's face going red and my mother's mouth opening in shock, because Grandma had seen it all, had watched everything, had noticed every single thing they thought she'd missed. Morrison continued reading. "Emma visited me every week for the last 10 years of my life, called me every Sunday, remembered every birthday and holiday, sat with me in the hospital during my pneumonia and my hip surgery and my final illness, while my son visited twice in the last month of my life, and my younger granddaughter came once." Claire made a wounded sound, and my mother immediately said, "She was busy, she had her own life, you can't expect—" But Morrison just kept reading, his voice never wavering. "I watched my son and daughter-in-law show blatant favoritism between their daughters for 3 decades. I watched them lavish attention and resources on Claire while taking Emma's steady presence for granted. I watched them miss Emma's high school graduation to attend Claire's cheerleading competition, forget Emma's 30th birthday entirely, ignore her professional achievements while celebrating Claire's most minor accomplishments." I was crying now, tears streaming down my face as Grandma's words validated every hurt I'd carried for years, every moment I'd told myself I was being too sensitive or expecting too much, and Morrison pulled a tissue box from a credenza behind him and slid it across the table to me without pausing in his reading. "Emma gave her parents $15,000 during a medical crisis and was never repaid. She has been the family's emotional support and financial backup while receiving neither appreciation nor reciprocation, and I will not stand by and watch her be exploited one more time, even from beyond the grave." My mother tried to interrupt again, saying, "This is completely unfair. We always loved both girls equally." And Morrison finally looked up from the document and said with surprising firmness, "Mrs. Thompson, I will ask you one final time to remain quiet until I've finished reading. These are your mother-in-law's last wishes, and they deserve to be heard in full." And something in his tone must have gotten through, because my mother actually closed her mouth, though her expression was murderous. Morrison paused in his reading, looked up at my family with an expression I couldn't quite read, and said, "There's a second document," and the words seemed to stop time for a moment, the entire room going absolutely silent, except for the hum of the ventilation system and Claire's ragged breathing from crying. He reached into his leather portfolio and produced a sealed envelope, cream-colored and heavy stock, and he held it up so we could all see that it was indeed sealed, that he was opening it for the first time in front of us, though I suspected he'd already read it in private to prepare for this meeting. Your grandmother, Morrison said carefully, updated her will 6 months ago with an addendum, specifically after the events of Christmas Day. And I felt my stomach drop because Christmas had been the engagement dinner, the night my parents had spent 3 solid hours celebrating Claire and Derek without asking me a single question about my life, the night I'd gone home and cried in my car before driving to my empty apartment. Morrison broke the seal and unfolded the document, adjusted his reading glasses again, and began. I am adding these provisions after witnessing my son and daughter-in-law's treatment of Emma at the Christmas gathering of December 25th, where they spent an entire meal celebrating one daughter while completely ignoring the other, where Emma's recent promotion to senior partner went unmentioned and unacknowledged, where I watched her try 3 separate times to share her news only to be talked over and dismissed. My mother made a sound like she'd been struck, and my father's expression shifted from anger to something closer to panic, because they were realizing that Grandma had seen everything, had been documenting everything, had been building a case against them even while sitting at their dinner table. Morrison continued reading. I can no longer pretend that my son will change, that he will suddenly see both his daughters clearly, and so I am implementing additional provisions to protect Emma from the pressure I know she will face after my death, because I know my family, and I know they will try to guilt her into sharing what I have left specifically to her. Claire had stopped crying and was staring at Morrison with wide eyes, and I could see her mind working, trying to figure out what this meant for her, always calculating what she could get. If Emma is allowed to receive her inheritance without harassment, pressure, or contestation, Morrison read, I have established a trust fund for Claire in the amount of $50,000, accessible when she turns 35, which is 6 years from the date of this addendum, but only if she has maintained steady employment for 3 consecutive years prior to that birthday. Claire gasped, and my mother said, What? And my father started to rise from his chair before apparently thinking better of it. Morrison kept reading as if there had been no interruption. I have also allocated $50,000 for my son and daughter-in-law, specifically earmarked for medical expenses and retirement health care, to be administered through this firm to ensure proper use of funds. My mother looked like she might faint, the color draining from her face as she realized there was money for them after all, that Grandma hadn't cut them off completely, but Morrison wasn't finished. However, these provisions only activate if Emma is permitted to receive her inheritance without any pressure, harassment, or legal contestation from family members, and if any attempt is made to contest this will, to pressure Emma into sharing, or to harass her in any way regarding her inheritance, these secondary provisions are void, and the funds will instead go to the following charitable organizations. And he read off a list of 3 charities, including the Women's Shelter, where Grandma had volunteered for 20 years. Morrison continued reading from the addendum, and his voice took on an even more serious tone as he said, Margaret included a direct statement about the family dynamics she observed, which she insisted be read verbatim. And I could see my mother's hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white, and my father's jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Morrison read, To my son and daughter-in-law, I need you to understand that you failed one daughter while spoiling another. You created a child who expects the world handed to her and dismissed a child who earned everything she achieved through her own merit and determination. And I will not reward your failure as parents by allowing you to pressure Emma into fixing the consequences of your choices. My mother made a choking sound and my father started to stand up, but Morrison held up one hand and said, Please, let me finish. There's a section addressed to each family member. And somehow his calm, professional demeanor made it impossible for my father to do anything but sit back down, though he looked like he wanted to flip the entire conference table. Morrison continued, To Claire, I want you to know that I love you. I have always loved you. But I love you enough to stop enabling the pattern your parents established. I will not fund your continued avoidance of responsibility and the expectation that someone else will always rescue you from the consequences of your decisions. Claire's face cycled through emotions so quickly I could barely track them: shock and hurt and anger, and something that might have been shame. And for the first time since we'd sat down, she actually looked at me. Really looked at me. And I saw something in her expression I'd never seen before. Something like recognition. "Emma owes you nothing," Morrison read, and those three words hung in the air like a bell that had been rung, clear and undeniable. "She has given you and your parents endless second chances, financial help, emotional support, and practical assistance, all of which was taken for granted and never reciprocated. And if you want financial security, Claire, I suggest you build it yourself the way your sister did, through work and discipline and showing up day after day even when it's hard." Morrison paused, took a sip of water from the glass at his elbow and said, "Margaret's statement concludes with, 'I know this will seem harsh to those who benefited from the old family dynamic, but it is the only way I know to bring justice to a situation that has been unjust for 3 decades. Emma deserves to be valued and protected, and since her own parents won't do it, I will.'" The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the faint tick of the wall clock, and I watched my father's face go from red to purple, that vein in his temple throbbing the way it always did when he was about to explode. And my mother looked genuinely shocked, like she'd been slapped awake from a pleasant dream into a nightmare. Because Grandma hadn't just seen through them, she'd documented it, named it, and made sure it would be read aloud in front of a witness after her death. Claire seemed frozen, caught between anger at being called out so explicitly and what looked like the first genuine moment of self-reflection I'd ever witnessed from her, and I could see her mind working behind her eyes, processing maybe for the first time that the family narrative about her being the one who needed more help was actually a story about her being enabled into helplessness. My father erupted from his chair so violently it scraped backward across the polished floor, and he slammed both hands down on the conference table hard enough that Morrison's water glass jumped, and he shouted, "This is manipulative from beyond the grave. This is a vindictive old woman trying to control us even after she's dead." And his face had gone that dangerous shade of purple I remembered from childhood when things didn't go his way. But Morrison didn't even flinch, just looked at my father with that same calm professional expression and said in a measured tone, "Mr. Thompson, your mother had every legal right to distribute her assets as she saw fit, and I can assure you that she was of completely sound mind and acting of her own free will when she created both the original will and this addendum." My mother had tears streaming down her face now, but they looked different from Claire's manipulative crying. These looked like genuine shock and hurt, and she said in a voice that shook, "How could she be so cruel to her own son? How could she write such terrible things about us? We loved her, we took care of her." And I almost laughed at the audacity of that last claim, because they'd visited her twice during her final hospital stay, while I'd been there every single day. Morrison reached for the document again and said, "Actually, Margaret anticipated this reaction specifically. There's an additional paragraph that addresses it directly." And he read, "I know my son will call this cruel, will claim I'm being vindictive or manipulative, but I need him to understand that I gave him and his wife the down payment on their house. I paid for both of my granddaughters' childhoods through gifts and support and college funds. And I was repaid by watching him treat his children with such obvious inequality that it broke my heart. I watched Emma be erased and dismissed and taken for granted year after year, and I remained silent, hoping that eventually he would see what he was doing and change, but he never did. They never did. And so this will is not cruelty. It is my final act of justice for the grandchild who loved me enough to show up, who visited me in the hospital every single day, who held my hand when I was dying, while my own son couldn't be bothered to come more than twice." The words hit my parents like physical blows, and I watched my mother's face crumple, and my father looked like he wanted to put his fist through the wall, and I was crying now, not the silent tears from earlier, but actual sobs that shook my whole body. Because Grandma had seen everything, had documented everything, had loved me enough to make sure that even after she was gone, I would know that someone had witnessed my pain and validated it. Claire had gone very quiet during my father's outburst and my mother's tears, and now she spoke for the first time since Morrison had started reading the addendum, her voice small and uncertain in a way I'd never heard from her before. What exactly are the employment requirements for the trust? Like what kind of job counts and how do you verify the 3 years? And I realized she was actually considering it, actually thinking about whether she could meet Grandma's conditions. And something about that question, the practicality of it, felt like maybe the first genuine moment between us in years, because she wasn't performing or manipulating. She was just asking a real question about a real challenge. Morrison pulled a leather folder from his briefcase and opened it to a page marked with a yellow tab, and he said, "The trust conditions are quite specific, Claire. Your grandmother worked with me extensively to ensure they were clear and achievable, but also meaningful." And I watched my sister lean forward in her chair, that calculating expression on her face that I recognized from every time she tried to figure out the minimum effort required to get what she wanted. But there was something else there too, something that looked almost like genuine interest. "The employment must be full-time," Morrison continued, "defined as a minimum of 35 hours per week. It must be with an employer who is not a family member and who provides standard tax documentation. So self-employment or working for your parents or other relatives doesn't qualify, and you need to maintain this employment continuously for 3 full years, which means if you quit or are terminated, the clock resets to 0. Claire's face went through several expressions as she processed this, and she asked, "What if I get laid off? Like if the company closes or does layoffs, does that reset the clock?" And Morrison nodded and said, "Margaret anticipated that question. If you're laid off through no fault of your own, and you secure new qualifying employment within 60 days, the clock continues, but you'll need to provide documentation of the layoff and proof that you actively sought new employment during that gap." My mother made a scoffing sound and said, "3 years of steady work for only $50,000. That's ridiculous. She's setting Claire up to fail." But Morrison's expression didn't change as he said, "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, Margaret specifically chose these conditions because she believed Claire was capable of meeting them, and there's an additional incentive structure." And he consulted the document again. If Claire successfully completes the 3-year employment requirement and receives the $50,000 at age 35, there's a second provision that releases an additional $25,000 when she turns 40, provided she's maintained steady employment for at least 4 of the 5 years between 35 and 40. The conditions are slightly more flexible for the second disbursement, because Margaret wanted to acknowledge that life circumstances change. Claire was doing math in her head. I could see it. $75,000 total if she could hold down a job for most of the next 11 years. And she asked quietly, "Is there anything else, like any other conditions?" And Morrison said, "Yes, there's a personal letter from your grandmother that's part of the trust documentation. I'm required to read it to you now." And he pulled out another page. Morrison read, "Claire, I love you enough to stop enabling you. Your parents' favoritism hurt you as much as it hurt your sister, just differently. They taught you that the world owed you something, and that you could always be rescued from your own choices. But the world doesn't owe you anything, and I won't be around to rescue you anymore, and neither should Emma. You're capable of so much more than you've shown. You're smart and personable and creative, but you've never had to develop discipline or follow through, because someone always caught you when you fell. I'm not being cruel. I'm giving you the gift of consequences and the opportunity to prove to yourself what you can do. If you meet these conditions, you'll have earned that money, and it will mean more to you than any amount I could have just handed you. Prove to me and to yourself that I'm right about your potential." The silence that followed was different from the angry silences earlier. This one felt heavy with something like grief or recognition, and I watched Claire's face and saw tears that looked real, not manipulative, just sad. And she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "She really thought I was capable of this?" And Morrison said gently, "She did. She told me several times that you'd been done a disservice by never being expected to stand on your own, and she hoped this would give you the motivation and structure to discover your own strength. My father seemed to gather himself after Claire's question, and I watched him calculate a new strategy in real time, his face shifting from that dangerous purple back to something more controlled, and he looked directly at me for the first time since Morrison had started reading the addendum and said in a voice that was clearly meant to sound reasonable and fatherly, "Emma, your grandmother was a bitter old woman who was trying to divide this family even from beyond the grave. You can see that, can't you? This whole elaborate scheme with conditions and trusts and her cruel words about us. She was always difficult and controlling, and now she's trying to control all of us, even after she's dead." And I felt something twist in my chest at hearing him describe Grandma that way, calling her bitter and difficult when she'd been the only source of unconditional love in my entire childhood. But before I could formulate a response, he continued, "But you're better than this, Emma. You're the good daughter, the responsible one. You can choose to rise above her manipulation and do the right thing. You can share your inheritance voluntarily. You can prove you're the bigger person and keep this family together." I felt it then, that old familiar pull, the conditioning of 32 years, telling me to smooth things over and keep the peace and make myself smaller so everyone else could be comfortable. The voice in my head that said maybe he was right, maybe I should just give them what they wanted so we could go back to normal. Except normal had meant being invisible and taken for granted and used. And I looked at Morrison, who was watching me with an expression that was carefully neutral but somehow encouraging. And he gave me the slightest nod like he was saying, "You can do this." And I found my voice and said no, and the word came out quieter than I'd intended. But it was there, it was said, and my mother actually gasped, like I'd physically slapped her across the face. "No?" my father repeated, his reasonable tone already starting to crack. But I kept going, my voice getting stronger as I continued. "Grandma wasn't bitter. She was the only person who ever truly saw me, the only one who celebrated my achievements, the only one who showed up." And my father tried to interrupt, saying, "Now, Emma, that's not fair, we always—" But I talked right over him for the first time in my entire life, and said, "I'm not finished." And the shock on his face would have been funny if I hadn't been shaking so hard, and I continued, "Grandma wasn't trying to divide this family, she was just finally naming what's been true my whole life, that you've treated Claire and me completely differently, that you've dismissed me and overlooked me and taken me for granted while you've coddled and enabled Claire, and she was tired of watching it happen and not saying anything." My voice was shaking, but I kept going, and I said, "You missed my high school graduation speech. I was valedictorian, and I'd worked for 4 years to earn that honor, and you didn't come because Claire had cheerleading tryouts that same afternoon, tryouts for a squad she didn't even make, and when I asked you about it later, you said Claire needed your support because she was nervous." And I saw my mother open her mouth to say something, but I didn't stop. The words were pouring out now after being held back for decades, and I continued. "You paid for Claire's Etsy store, and then her boutique idea, and then her social media consulting business, 3 failed businesses that cost you over $40,000 total. But when I asked if you could help with my student loans while I was working full-time and going to school, you said I needed to learn financial responsibility." And my father's face was getting red again, but I kept talking. Louder now. "You forgot my 30th birthday, completely forgot it. I waited all day for a call or a text or anything and got nothing, and then 3 weeks later you threw Claire a party for her 27th birthday that cost thousands of dollars. I know because Mom posted all the pictures on Facebook with captions about celebrating her baby, and when I finally mentioned that you'd missed my birthday, Mom said I should have reminded you because you had a lot going on." I took a breath and looked directly at my father and said, 2 years ago, when you had your health scare and needed money for the medical bills your insurance didn't cover, I gave you $15,000 from my savings. I didn't loan it to you. I gave it to you because you're my father, and I loved you, and I wanted to help, and you never paid me back. Never even mentioned paying me back. But 6 months later, Claire totaled my car that I'd let her borrow, and when I asked her to pay the insurance deductible, you called me petty and said I should be grateful she wasn't hurt and that I could afford another car. My mother tried to interrupt then, saying, "Emma, you're twisting everything. We've always loved you both equally." But I shook my head and said, "Love isn't just a word, it's actions. It's showing up, it's remembering, it's caring about someone's life enough to ask about it." And I turned to look at Claire, who was staring at the table, and I said directly to her, "At your engagement dinner, Mom and Dad spent 3 hours asking Derek about his job and his family and his plans. They talked about your wedding ideas and your future house and your someday children. And not one single person asked me a single question about my life. I'd made senior partner at my firm 2 weeks earlier, the youngest person to ever achieve that at Whitman and Associates. And I'd hoped maybe that night I could share that news and you'd all be proud of me, but there wasn't room in the conversation for anything except Claire's happiness." Claire's face was flushed now, and she still wouldn't meet my eyes, and I felt something crack open in my chest as I said, "I gave and gave and gave, because I thought if I was just good enough, helpful enough, selfless enough, if I just demanded less and provided more, you'd finally see me. But Grandma's right, you never will, because you don't want to see me. You want me to be the reliable one who doesn't need anything so you can focus all your attention on Claire, who apparently needs everything." My mother made a sound like she was choking and said, "Emma, you don't mean that. You're upset right now, but you'll regret saying these terrible things. We've always done our best for both of you girls." But I shook my head and said, "No, Mom, you did your best for Claire. I was just expected to raise myself and then help raise her too." And my father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and he pointed his finger at me the way he used to when I was a child and had disappointed him. Except I couldn't actually remember a specific time he'd done that, because I'd always been too busy trying to be perfect to disappoint anyone, and he said in a voice that was cold and final, "Then you're no longer part of this family. If you're going to stand there and accuse your mother and me of being terrible parents and refuse to help your sister when she needs you, then as far as I'm concerned you can consider yourself an only child, because you won't be welcome in our home anymore." I felt the words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment I was 8 years old again, desperate for my father's approval, terrified of being left out in the cold, and some part of me wanted to take it all back and apologize and beg them to still love me. But then I thought about Grandma's face in the hospital, when she'd made me promise not to give up what was rightfully mine. And I thought about all the times I'd already been left out in the cold while they gathered around Claire in the warmth, and I realized I'd been living as an only child for years. I just hadn't named it yet, so I looked directly at my father and said, "I haven't been part of this family for years, not really. I've been the family servant, the backup plan, the reliable one you call when you need something but never think about otherwise, and I'm done pretending that's the same thing as being loved." My mother's face crumpled, and she tried one more manipulation, saying, "Emma, how can you do this to your sister? Claire looks up to you, she's always admired you, and this is how you repay her love." And I felt something like laughter bubble up in my throat, except it wasn't funny at all. And I said, "Then maybe watching me establish boundaries will teach her something Grandma wanted her to learn, that you can't just expect other people to fund your life and fix your problems, that sometimes you have to do hard things yourself." Morrison cleared his throat then and said in his calm professional voice, "Let me state clearly for the record that Ms. Emma Thompson has made no agreements to share her inheritance beyond the terms established in Mrs. Margaret Thompson's will. The family has been duly informed of all conditions and provisions, and my firm will handle all estate transfers according to the deceased's explicit wishes. Ms. Thompson, here is my card. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, and I'm personally ensuring her wishes are honored to the letter." Claire stood up suddenly, her chair falling backward with a crash that made everyone jump, and she looked at me for the first time since I'd started speaking. Her face was blotchy and streaked with tears, but there was something else there too. Maybe the first glimmer of understanding, or maybe just shock that I'd finally fought back. And she didn't say anything, just grabbed her purse and walked out of the conference room, and my parents exchanged a look and then followed her. But my mother paused at the door and turned back to deliver one final blow, saying, "Don't expect us at your wedding, Emma, if you ever have one, which seems unlikely since you're clearly as cold and bitter as your grandmother was. I don't know how I raised such a selfish daughter." And then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a soft click that seemed louder than a slam would have been. I sat alone in the conference room after the door closed behind my mother, and my whole body was shaking like I'd just run a marathon, adrenaline flooding through me so intensely that I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. And I couldn't quite believe that I'd actually done it, that I'd actually stood up to them after 32 years of trying to be good enough and small enough and undemanding enough to earn their love. Morrison was still sitting across from me, and he stood slowly and walked to the credenza against the wall where there was a water pitcher and glasses, and he poured me a glass with steady hands and brought it to me, setting it down gently and saying, "Ms. Thompson, you did exactly what your grandmother hoped you'd do. She would be very proud of you right now." And I took a shaky sip of water and felt tears start again, because it mattered so much to hear that, to know that someone was proud of me, that I hadn't just destroyed my family for nothing. Morrison sat back down and folded his hands on the table and said, "I want you to know something, Emma. Your grandmother came to see me 2 years ago. It was right after your 30th birthday, and she told me that her son had forgotten his daughter's birthday entirely, and that was the moment she knew she needed to take action to protect you." And I looked up at him in surprise, because I hadn't realized Grandma had known about the forgotten birthday. I'd never told her because I hadn't wanted to burden her with my pain, but apparently she'd found out somehow. Maybe she'd called my parents' house that day, and they'd revealed it in conversation. Or maybe she'd just known me well enough to hear the hurt in my voice when we'd talked a few days later. Morrison continued, "She spent months working with me to structure her will in a way that would give you not just financial resources, but legal protection. She knew your family would pressure you to share. She'd watched them do it your entire life, and she wanted to make sure that when the time came, you'd have the support you needed to say no." And his voice was kind but matter-of-fact, and I realized that my grandmother had seen me so clearly, had understood exactly what I would face, and had tried to prepare for it, had tried to give me armor for a battle she knew was coming. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out an envelope, cream-colored and substantial, and he slid it across the table to me and said, "Your grandmother left this for you personally, to be given to you only after the will reading, and only if you didn't cave to family pressure. She believed you'd find your strength." And she was right. And I took the envelope with trembling hands and saw my name written on the front in Grandma's distinctive handwriting. The letters slightly shaky because she'd written this in the last months of her life, but still unmistakably hers. And I carefully opened the envelope and pulled out several pages of cream stationery covered in her writing. I began reading the letter through tears that blurred the words on the page, and I had to keep blinking them away so I could see my grandmother's handwriting. Slightly shaky, but still unmistakably hers. And the letter started, "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, it means you found the strength I always knew was in you, and I am so very proud." And I felt something break open in my chest, decades of holding myself together suddenly coming undone because someone was proud of me. Someone saw what it had cost me to stand up for myself. The letter continued for 3 pages, and Grandma wrote about specific memories I'd forgotten or hadn't realized she knew about, like the time I won the state accounting competition in college and called to tell her, and she could hear in my voice that my parents hadn't congratulated me, or the time I'd shown up to her house for Sunday dinner with red eyes and claimed it was allergies, but she'd known my mother had criticized everything about me that day, from my hair to my career to my decision to stay single. She wrote, "I watched you shrink yourself for years trying to fit into the space they were willing to give you. And it broke my heart because you were always meant to take up so much more room than that. You were always meant to shine. And they were so busy polishing Claire that they never saw the diamond they already had in you. And I had to set the letter down for a moment because I was crying too hard to read. Morrison sat quietly, not rushing me, just letting me have this moment with my grandmother's words, and when I could breathe again, I picked the letter back up and kept reading. Grandma explained why she'd structured the will the way she had, writing, "I know it might seem harsh to give Claire conditions instead of immediate money, but the greatest failure your parents committed was teaching her she didn't have to earn anything. They crippled her just as surely as they erased you, just in a different way, and I love her enough to stop participating in her destruction." She wrote about the lake house, how she'd bought it herself after Grandpa died, with money she'd earned and saved, and how it had been her place of independence and peace, and she wanted me to have that same sanctuary. The letter ended with words I knew I would carry with me for the rest of my life. "Emma, you were always enough, even when they made you feel like you weren't, even when they demanded more and more, and still looked past you. You were always enough. You are enough right now, and I need you to promise me something. Promise me you'll never let anyone make you small again. Promise me you'll take up space and shine and live the life you've earned. I see you, sweetheart. I've always seen you. And I love you exactly as you are. Love, Grandma." I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest. And Morrison gave me a moment before he said gently, "There are some practical matters we should discuss: the estate transfer timeline, the deed to the lake house, the investment accounts." And I nodded and tried to pull myself together enough to focus. He walked me through the details, explaining that the paperwork would take approximately 2 weeks to process. The investment accounts were well managed and diversified. The lake house deed was straightforward. And I listened and took notes, but part of my mind was still with Grandma's letter, still processing the gift she'd given me of finally being seen. Morrison stood and walked to a cabinet along the wall and said, "Your grandmother also left a small box for you. It's been in our office safe. She brought it when she updated the will 6 months ago." And he retrieved a wooden box about the size of a shoebox, cherry wood polished to a soft shine, and he set it on the table in front of me. I opened it with careful hands, and inside I found treasures I hadn't known existed. A ring that I recognized immediately as Grandma's, not the wedding ring Grandpa had given her, but a different one, a simple gold band with a small emerald, and there was a note tucked beside it that read, "I bought this for myself on my 60th birthday. After your grandfather died, it was my independence ring, my reminder that I could take care of myself. I want you to have it now." Beneath the ring was a photo album, leather-bound and heavy, and when I opened it I found pages and pages of photographs and newspaper clippings and programs, every single one about me: my high school graduation program with valedictorian speech noted, a newspaper clipping about my college scholarship, a program from the accounting awards ceremony, photographs I didn't know anyone had taken of me at my college graduation and at various other events, and I realized Grandma had been documenting my life, celebrating my achievements privately, when no one else was doing it publicly. 2 months later, I was sitting on the dock at the lake house, my lake house now, legally and officially mine, with the deed transferred and recorded and the keys in my pocket. And it was early evening in late spring, with the sun starting its descent toward the tree line across the water, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that made the lake look like it was made of honey. The past 8 weeks had been a strange mixture of grief and relief and growth. Like I was shedding an old skin that had never quite fit right and growing into something new that I was still learning the shape of. My parents had sent exactly one email 3 days after the will reading, a cold, formal message from my father's account demanding that I apologize for my disrespect and reconsider my selfish decision before permanently damaging family relationships, and I had read it twice and then deleted it without responding because I finally understood that no answer I gave would ever be the right one. They weren't actually asking a question, they were issuing an ultimatum, and I was done accepting ultimatums from people who had never truly seen me. Claire had surprised me, though. About 3 weeks after everything happened, she'd sent a text message at 11 o'clock at night that read, "I got a job, full-time, retail management at the outlet mall. I'm still mad at you, but maybe Grandma had a point. Derek and I are figuring things out without the house money. It's hard, but I'm not as helpless as everyone always treated me. And I had stared at that message for a long time before responding with simple encouragement, telling her I was proud of her for trying. And we'd exchanged a few more texts since then, nothing deep or particularly warm, but it was honest in a way our relationship had never been before, and I thought maybe that was what Grandma had hoped for. Not that we'd be close necessarily, but that we'd both be free to become whoever we actually were, instead of the roles our parents had assigned us. I'd started therapy 2 weeks after the will reading, finding a woman named Dr. Chen, who specialized in family systems and trauma, and I was slowly unpacking decades of conditioning that had taught me my worth was measured by how much I could give away, how small I could make myself, how little I could need. Rachel had driven up to visit the lake house twice already, and she'd helped me start thinking about it as my retreat, my sanctuary, not just the place that had been Grandma's. And we'd spent hours sitting on this same dock drinking wine and talking about what I wanted my life to look like now that I wasn't spending all my energy trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. I'd taken Grandma's apple pie recipe, the one written in her careful handwriting with notes in the margins about making sure the apples weren't too wet, and the importance of cold butter. And I'd had it professionally framed, and it was hanging in the lake house kitchen now, the first thing you saw when you walked in, a reminder that some things are precious enough to protect, to keep just for yourself. I wore Grandma's independence ring every day now, the simple gold band with the small emerald on my right hand, and sometimes I would catch myself turning it with my thumb during difficult moments, remembering that she had bought it for herself at 60, that it was never too late to claim your own life. At work, I'd noticed a shift in myself. I was more assertive in meetings. I'd stopped volunteering to fix other people's mistakes or cover for colleagues who consistently underperformed. And when my manager had asked me to take on yet another project that wasn't my responsibility, I'd said no for the first time in my career, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, my manager had simply nodded and asked someone else. I felt Grandma's presence constantly, not in a supernatural way, but in the growing sense of self-worth that I knew she'd tried to give me all along, in every birthday card and phone call and private conversation where she'd told me I was enough exactly as I was. I'd made peace with the family estrangement, or at least accepted it, understanding that the door was open if they ever genuinely changed. But I wasn't going to stand on their porch begging for scraps of affection anymore. I wasn't going to shrink myself down to fit through a crack they might occasionally open. The sun was almost touching the trees now, and the water had gone from honey-colored to something deeper, richer, like amber or old gold. And I thought about everything Grandma had left me, not just the money or the house or the physical objects in that cherry wood box, but something so much more valuable than any of that. She'd left me permission to value myself, an actual blueprint for setting boundaries, and most importantly, proof that someone had seen my worth all along, had documented it and celebrated it and wanted to protect it even after she was gone. I'd spent 32 years trying to earn something I'd already had, trying to prove I was worthy of love to people who had decided long ago that I was valuable only in what I could provide them, and Grandma's final gift was showing me that I didn't need their recognition because I had always been enough. I had always been worthy. I had always mattered. I finally saw it now, saw myself the way she had always seen me, and it was like putting on glasses for the first time and realizing the world had edges and details you'd been missing your whole life. The first stars were starting to appear in the sky, faint against the deepening blue, and I whispered into the evening air over the lake, "Thank you, Grandma. I understand now," and I felt a peace settle over me that I'd been searching for my entire life, the peace of finally coming home to myself.